Hey there, I'm Christopher Schoenwald, and welcome to Life as a show intently focused on helping people find their professional pathway by exploring and unearthing the details of jobs from around the world. Before we get into today's episode, I just want to throw this out there. I have a channel over on YouTube, Life as a ... which basically hosts highlights from these audio conversations that I have with these great guests. They typically run 10 to 15 minutes, and they're there to kind of present a different vantage point. You know, for people that aren't into audio, aren't into podcasts, but are still looking for career advice, ideas, help, all that great stuff, send them over to YouTube. Like I said, Life as a ... And if you do get over there, I would love that like or subscribe. I mean, it's the best way to let that algorithm know that the content is worth sharing and should be out there. So anyway, I do thank you for letting me plug this a little bit, but I think it's about time to get into today's episode. When you think of the word education, what springs to mind when considering careers? I'm guessing that 99.9% of you thought teacher. Well, there are several reasons for this, none greater than the fact that most of us have intimate memories and encounters with such educational professionals. However, from a career standpoint, the world of education offers a lot more in terms of possibility and opportunity. And this episode represents one such exploration. I'd like you to meet Dawn Lee DiPeri. She's a passionate educator who just so happens to work for one of the most recognizable and reputable organizations out there in UNICEF. In this engaging career chat, we dive into her work as a global content lead as far as what that means and how it relates to creating educational impact. And spoiler alert, the team she is part of is responsible for a program that serves youth in over 40 countries and reaches over 6.4 million people. Yeah, she knows a thing or two on educational impact. And you're going to learn all about her work and the opportunities out there within education that combine aspects of teaching, pedagogy, design, and technology. Now, all up, this talk will be an eye-opener for anyone with an interest in education and empowerment. But perhaps it's time to get down to business. So let me more formally introduce our guest to you, and we can get into things. Dawn Lee DiPeri is an education specialist and content lead at UNICEF Learning Passport and Vice President of East End Advertising, Graphic, and Instructional Design. Now at UNICEF, Dawn leads the content department, which helps dozens of countries create, curate, procure, and adapt educational materials for children, adolescents, and educators. Dawn also helps train on topics of online pedagogy, digital, and blended learning, and edtech. Prior to working for UNICEF, Dawn was a learning designer and faculty developer at Harvard Graduate School of Education. Dawn taught online, hybrid, and face-to-face at the college level, teaching graphic design, new media, and interpersonal communications. Dawn has also co-owned a design firm since 2012 with clients ranging from education, nonprofit, healthcare, and workforce development. And she is also the author of Graphic Design for Course Creators, Digitally Accessible, Visually Appealing Courses, published by Press Books with a CC BY Creative Commons license. And Dawn has earned her Doctor of Management in Higher Education, Teaching and Learning, and her Master of Fine Arts in Advertising. So with all of this noted, I'd like to welcome you to my conversation with Dawn Lee DiPeri. Yeah, so welcome to the program. How are you doing today, Dawn?
I'm doing great. How are you?
Yeah, really good. I'm quite keen to get into this conversation. I think the work that you do is absolutely fascinating, and I'm, eager to share it with listeners. So I do have this first segment lined up for us today. It's called Coloring Wikipedia. As my listeners know, it's a segment where I just read off a definition of something that relates to what the guest does. And I put you down here for digital learning. And I'll just read that off for you, and maybe afterwards you can comment. Does that sound okay?
Sounds great.
Okay, so here we go. Digital learning. Digital learning is any type of learning that is accompanied by technology or by instructional practice that makes effective use of technology. It encompasses the application of a wide spectrum of practices, including blended and virtual learning. A digital learning strategy may include any or a combination of any of the following: adaptive learning, badging and gamification, blended learning, classroom technologies, e-textbooks, mobile learning using mobile phones, tablet, laptops, computers, personalized learning, online learning or e-learning, virtual reality, augmented reality. A bit of a mouthful, a lot to unpack there, but first take, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think that's pretty comprehensive and like you're describing kind of like a generalist, I think, in the digital learning arena. So I can relate to many of those areas that I've dabbled in and others that I maybe more specialize in. So, for example, my role is like currently like a combination of technology and pedagogy, right? So it's like I work on an ed tech product. I help to produce learning, so digital learning or like e-learning. I've done e-learning development, but I've also worked as like a strategist or an instructional designer as well. So I kind of like do a mixture of like in the weeds type of stuff where I go really deep on certain projects, and then a lot of like more general types of things of like maybe reviewing strategy documents or like working with government counterparts on like their overall plan for digital learning in a situation like a humanitarian crisis. So it's very dynamic and it
Yeah.
encompasses a lot of what you kind of described.
Yeah. And we were just speaking off air that you're mentioning your actual title and role and responsibility is something that not a lot of people do. It's quite specialized in that sense. Maybe you could share that with listeners as well. I found that to be quite interesting.
Yeah, so like in the United Nations, you have like a title associated with your role. Like, so whether you're like a director or you work as in education. So, like, my technical title, I guess, would be education specialist. But like the title that you like, I would put on my signature and stuff is like global content lead. And I think even my title alone can be confusing because it could be perceived as like when you say content, that could be something like marketing or communication. So
Right.
to just want to differentiate that, like what I do is like more learning, like learning strategy, learning engineering versus like graphic design and communication, which
Hmm.
I've done in the past and still do bilaterally, like with my own business a little bit. And I do have a specialization in visual communication, along with a couple other like things related to that. My role is in that like digital learning space.
Well, maybe to add some further clarity to all of this, I have this other segment lined up called A Day in the Life, which, as it sounds, we kind of like dive into it. So, some of your workload and what takes up your time throughout a day or perhaps a week, even. You could share with listeners a little bit more about that.
Sure. Well, I'm currently working on a product called the Learning Passport, and it's a combination between Microsoft and UNICEF. We work on the Microsoft Community Training Platform. So it's a little bit of learning management administration, but it's not just working with the LMS, but it's delivering kind of like an ecosystem of care. We have like a full staff with like monitoring and evaluation and data, and we have growth, and we have all kinds of things to support countries with their implementation of the Learning Passport. We have 40 different countries that
Oh,
we
wow.
support currently. So
Wow.
my day in the life can be very varied because I could in a single day I could be talking to say three different countries, from all around the world. So and their unique humanitarian contexts are very different from each other. So as a learning designer, we really have to do a lot of like needs analysis and dive into like what does that context look like and provide support based on those factors, which can be challenging because I'm based out of New York. So I don't get to travel as much as I would like, but I do my best to do research and travel when I can to just get a clearer picture of what that context is so I can support them. And some of the ways that I support them is like by, for example, they may have a reason for having a learning passport, and that might be continuity of instruction, is often the case. So if there's like a climate disaster and children can't go to school, or like if their war or trauma has occurred and there's like a refugee situation and they're trying to continue the learning from their country that they were leaving, there could be, in some cases, it's like directed towards teachers, like teacher professional development or humanitarian workers, or it has like, it's a really flexible of a program. I'm generally in like the K through 12 space, teacher professional development, and a little bit of like older adolescents. It really is varied, which is very different from my past life in academia, which was just like all, faculty and like the
Yeah.
typical college age students. So it's very interesting.
Yeah, it sounds like it. Like, I think one of the words you used was a challenge. I could see that being part of this as well, but also too like a high degree of fulfillment. And I think we're going to get into that later on in this conversation. But I can see both, being fully integrated into that work. A quick question in terms of like the delivery of some of this content. You and your team are actually creating content, or is this more of like the actual delivery of the content itself, like the platform, or a bit of both?
A little bit of both. I don't get to do as much hands-on of designing content that's child facing. I will do a little bit of it, but I sometimes have e-learning designers that work with me that will do that or are hired for a country to produce it or digitize it. So they get content in a few different ways, like whether they're procuring it, it's donated, if it's digitized, so like face-to-face curriculum, like worksheets that need to be turned into digital. I do a lot of e-learning that's more like prototyping. So like I'll show like, okay, here's a PDF that you used to use. This is what it could look like if you use it, say with Genially or Articulate Rise, or like I'll help them build lesson plans as like a prototype so that they can see like how to improve content and how to move things in a formally face-to-face environment into a either fully online or a blended environment more and more. So I'll do a lot of training and then I produce content sometimes for teachers and for adults and a little bit for students, but not as much because I'm just so spread thin. I really can't do a lot of that. I only have small opportunities to do more of the hands-on stuff.
Like I said, challenge comes to mind. But again, a certain degree of fulfillment in all of this as well, I could see. And really quickly as well, I understand that you have your own advertising, graphic design boutique firm as well on top of all of this. Maybe if you could share with listeners what you're involved in there and how that relates up to this mission that you currently have.
Yeah, I've had that business since 2012, and I honestly don't have much time for it anymore, but we have like a couple of clients we can do here and there still just because I only have so many hours in the day. But back in the day, I used to do a lot more work with it. Started as advertising brand and branding, graphic design. And then we started to branch into some more like instructional design, instructor led training. And so it's kind of both. And I've had that. I have a co founder with that company. She has a background in advertising, and we used to work in healthcare, nonprofit space, and like the high, like net worth, high income nonprofit and retail space. Like I live in Long Island, out by way out east by the Hamptons, so it's kind of like a niche. Produce that kind of high level of work and education. We had a couple of clients that were like colleges and workforce development agencies.
Yeah, I could envision like what you were just describing for your work with UNICEF and then throwing that in there as well. That it would
Yeah.
be a bit of a challenge. It was one of the big questions that I had is like, how do you manage both of these things? Because running a business unto
Yeah.
itself can be quite demanding. And then you tack on, the work that you're doing at UNICEF as well. Yeah. But I think you answered that
Yeah.
there.
It's like I thought about kind of like not having that business, but then it's like with the way things are now, there's so many layoffs, and it's like
Yeah.
it's always good to have like a second stream of income as a just in case type of thing. And it's very rewarding to be an entrepreneur too. Like you could just pick it up. I never had problems finding clients. In fact, I'm always like turning them down.
Yeah.
Like I can't really, so I think it'll be okay. I'm going to
Yeah.
try to keep it alive for a little bit.
Yeah. I'd imagine as well that it gives you a different like viewpoint or vantage point on certain things, and perhaps there's crossover there where some of the ideas that you're gaining in one sphere are kind of transferable or adaptable to another, and it might provide some sort of like level of varied insight or maybe even inspiration at times too.
Yeah. And the network.
Yeah.
I feel like the network was important. So, like being in the UN, I'm fairly new to that, only like 2.5 years. I spent most of my life in academia and in like corporate, like having my
Yeah.
own company and so forth. So it's like nice to have that network that I had from my previous life because it does benefit my role now tremendously.
Yeah, absolutely. We could slide into this other segment here, a pathways one. And I'd like to dive into the past a little bit here and find out how you made your way into your present day work. How did this all evolve?
Yeah, so my undergrad was in visual communications, and I like did a lot of graphic design and advertising. So I worked in publishing, newspaper, magazines, and in advertising like ad agencies. And then when I got my master's, I got it in advertising, an MFA. And with an MFA, you're able to teach. And so I was just always like interested in teaching. I love public speaking. I love, talking to other kids, adults, students. And anyway, so I started teaching and I taught in a couple of things because they had the communications, advertising, and graphic design background. I taught at a school that for graphic design, animation, interpersonal communications, a couple business type classes. And then one of the most interesting roles was when I was teaching future teachers educational technology. Because if you work as a graphic designer, you work with a lot of software, and I taught a lot of software. And future teachers need to be like tech savvy now more than ever.
Right.
So that got me interested in just improving my practice of instruction. Like future teachers are so inspiring, and they know so well like how to teach.
Yeah.
And then when I was teaching online, that's when I became interested even more in instructional design, because it was like I had the UX background. So I'd be on the learning management system and being like, I don't really like the way this is designed. The navigation's not really great. I feel like I want to be able to inspire and have more like
Hmm.
peer to peer or instructor to peer conversations. And I find ways to build that within the constraints that I have, but was so interested in learning like how to improve it. Because back then when I first started, like online education didn't have a very good reputation, I feel like. And then obviously when COVID happened, things really like picked up. But got my doctorate in higher education teaching and learning, which was kind of a lot, a big part of that is instructional design, a lot of the coursework that I did. So learning design, organizational development,
Hmm.
management, but in that space, like teaching and learning. So my
Yeah.
specialty was in higher ed teaching and learning, and learned all about like learning science. And I was in academia as a professor, and I transferred over to faculty development. So I started adult learning. I worked at Harvard as like a faculty developer, and I really liked that role. I did a lot of accessibility and inclusion things. And then I left Harvard for the UN, partly because they wanted people to be on site. And I was in New York. And so we didn't want to move at the time. And so I found a role that I could be remote. And I found the United Nations, UNICEF. I just got lucky, really. I didn't know anybody who worked there. So I was really felt like the whole time I feel blessed that I'm working here. So it was like a
Yeah.
whole changing of culture and changing out of industries and learning a whole new language.
I
So
bet. I
that's
bet.
where I am now for the last like 2.5 years.
And what strikes me there in listening to all of this is like, I'm guessing that you had a lot of different interests. I mean, you were just explaining like an intense interest towards education, towards design, towards several different things. And like early on, was it difficult for you to kind of find a way of bringing some of these elements together to find a pathway forward? Was there any moments there where it was like, well, what am I going to do with all of this? Like, I know what I like. These are some things that I'm after. But was it, like I said, a challenge to kind of put that together in such a way that you could find a career pathway for yourself?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny that you asked that, because like you don't know back in the day. It's not like I planned all of this in these exact steps, but I remember being really devastated over not getting a tenure track position as a professor, and I thought that that's what I wanted.
Yeah.
And then like looking back a couple years later working at Harvard and being like, I'm so fulfilled right now, and like I don't think I would have been happy at the school that I lost that
Mm,
role to. And after all of those interviews and all of that intense, it was like I felt so bad about myself, now looking back, I'm like, I think I was meant to do the path that I am in now. So I guess that's like part of a words of wisdom I give younger folks is like sometimes one door, like if it closes, another one opens, and it's for the best. And if I hadn't gotten into Harvard, I might not have been looked at the United Nations. Who knows,
right.
So I think one of the things I struggle with many interests is I was always artistic, but like a nerd, like very, I like things that are intellectually challenging. And so I didn't always feel like in advertising and graphic design, it was enough of a challenge that way for
I
my
see.
brain,
Yeah. 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 Yeah.
And so I always sought after the clients that were like really intense and like
Mm,
dense information, like things like college stuff or workforce development, versus my partner would sometimes do more of like the package design.
yeah.
And she thought that was fun. And yeah, it's pretty, but it just wasn't challenging me as much.
Mm,
So I really love the path that I took because it's like creative. I do get to do creative hands on stuff. I get to work with people. I get to challenge myself all the time with technology and interpersonal communications and just solving really complex world problems. So it's
yeah.
like very fulfilling.
Yeah, absolutely. It sounds like you found that perfect fit for yourself. At least the perspective that, like it's been shared here and what I'm getting from this conversation thus far. It feels like
Yeah.
all the boxes have been checked in terms of what you're after, what you need, and yeah, what you're getting or what you're
Yeah.
involved in right now. So yeah, okay. And it also speaks to this point of, like you'd mentioned already, career pathways aren't always so linear, right? I speak to professionals all the time on this program, and it's so rare that somebody has this vision and takes it from A all the way to Z, and it just goes in that straight line. There's always Johns off
Yeah.
to the left, to the right, roundabouts and
Yeah.
everything else in between. It's funny how oftentimes these things do have a way of working themselves out. Well, I do have another segment here, a Q&A discovery. We can kind of continue this back and forth. And I was thinking we could return to your work at UNICEF and the Learning Passport. I'd like to learn a little bit more about that. As far as what's gone into making that such a big success, and also, too, I mean, in terms of some of your skills and abilities that you draw upon when executing some of the tasks that you're involved in.
So that's a lot to unpack. I can't take credit for all of the success that it's had. It has, like, I work with some of the most brilliant people. I'm so lucky. My team is really great. So it's a combined success, I think, of all of us working. And obviously, I think having the partners that we do make it happen as well. Because, for anything with like UNICEF, we're funded from donors. We're grateful for that. It's like the success is not for one person. So one of the things, I'm big into open educational resources. So I passionate about that when I was a professor and passionate about that when I was like a faculty developer and when I was a graphic designer or am whatever, because I'm an artist, right? So I think it's important to protect intellectual property and to all of that, right? And then I'm also, as an educator, find it super important to be able to give access and equity to children and college kids like all over the world, even if you don't have the money to purchase those ridiculous textbooks. So I've always been really passionate about open educational resources. I think I spend a lot of time in the library. I love so one of the things that I do is try to find open educational resources for countries that are looking to fill curriculum gaps. And sometimes they don't have materials, digital learning materials in the languages or culturally relevant, culturally responsive materials. And so I draw upon my experience or passion for open educational resources and try to find things that may be like created in English and then show them how to like adapt it, like how to insert audio from a native speaker or how to change the characters, the illustrations of the characters so they look like the children of that particular geographic area. And then I help to create things from scratch that have like never existed before. So I'm super excited about that. And then putting them out in the public domain. So like I feel like I'm giving back in that way. So I would say like that's one big skill or area that I have really helpful for my role today. Other skills, let's see. Yeah, technology skills, super important. I could pick up technology pretty quickly. So I'm constantly like dabbling in new tools and I don't like no for an answer. So if I can't figure something out, I try a different way. So that kind of like tenacity and not being afraid of technology really works for me. And because I've worked on so many different types of software, I can pick it up quickly because of that, because it's just kind of intuitive after a while. For example, Adobe Creative Suite. Most people, I think that that has a high learning curve, but I've used that since like 2000 or some 2003. So I'm used to playing around with software. So that's helpful. And maybe like public speaking, I guess I would say communication, interpersonal communication is really important. The wanting to be inclusive and wanting to communicate well and just be an inclusive leader, I think is also really helpful.
What percentage of the project would you say requires you to kind of draw upon existing skills and abilities versus say what percent of your workload is demanding that you upskill, whether it's learning, something new in relation to technology or something else? Like what is that balance like?
I'd say like 80-20. I feel like
Okay.
probably I'm learning new things about 20% of the time. Maybe in the first year, it was probably like 60-40 because
Yeah, right,
you're
right.
learning a new industry and you're learning new specific tools and ways of working. Like, just even the simple things of, is the infrastructure of your department using Google and Google Drive, or are you now in SharePoint, or like even those things, just having to kind of switch gears. Are you doing Teams? Are you doing Slack? How does project management happen? Like a lot of everybody's role, I feel like that's so important in project management. Like, how are you keeping track of your tasks? That kind of thing. Just that learning curve was intense in the beginning of how to just catch up to this whole new culture and organization and way of working with 7 regions of around the world and people on all different time zones is the
Yeah.
other challenge. Like sometimes I can only talk to people late at night or early in the morning. And so it becomes like that hours get blurred. So very, but dynamic and fun and rewarding.
Yeah, it sounds like it. It sounds like it. I think that's probably a nice balance too. I mean, as it evens out in 80-20, where you're constantly challenging yourself, and pushing forward and
Yeah.
learning new things. And that's oftentimes where a lot of the fulfillment comes from,
Mhm.
exposing yourself to new ideas and coming up with new insights, new ideas of how you can kind of push your work forward in different ways. So this other question here too, in terms of your work, what would you say are some of the more, I don't know, lesser known elements relating to your role and responsibility, but in your mind are absolutely critical to the overall success that you might be having or hoping to have?
I would say communication skills are so important, specifically written. When you work with people with native languages that are different than your own, and maybe you know this too because you're in Japan, right? And you
Yeah.
probably see that you have to be really careful with your language. Like you're trying to avoid things like idioms or just being really straightforward, succinct, and just the nuances of cross-cultural communication. Maybe if that's obvious when you think you're working for the United Nations, but it's just like I didn't realize how important it is specifically to write succinctly and in a way that is like clear. It's
Yeah.
so important. I find before when I was in academia, my way I spoke and the way that I wrote, I was very like, when you use Grammarly, it's on like the academic dissertation level.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
That's like how I write, like naturally. So I kind of have to like, tone it down and make it just a little bit more simple and clear. Like nobody wants to read a super long email, and I
Yeah.
struggle with that
Yeah.
still. Like I'm trying to be succinct. So I'd say that's a big one for me. I'm always trying to improve.
Yeah, yeah, that's a really good point. And it's one that I certainly wouldn't have considered, but when you raise it, and as you just spelled it out there, it makes complete sense. And it kind of speaks to that point of even advertising in a way, right? Your background there, like knowing
Yeah.
your audience, right? Knowing what their needs are. So if you are communicating with people around the world, right, paring things down and putting it into a language that is easily accessible and understandable, that makes sense. I can, yeah, and definitely being here in Japan, this is something I can relate to as well at
Yeah.
different points. So much so that it's flipped for me at different points where, and being here for about 20 plus years now, the way I speak now, as opposed to, I don't know, when I'd first come, I think I've slowed down even like the cadence of delivery at different points. I noticed that in myself or even how I'm communicating things with people back home. And I think initially it was a shock to me and maybe in my family, perhaps as well, like, oh, you've changed. And I can't really pinpoint what it was. And came out that form of communication had changed. You begin to take
Yeah.
these things on. So yeah. Anyway, though, I definitely, I can
And
appreciate
I
that
have
point.
to work at speaking slower because in New York, everybody speaks so fast. So,
Right.
and I'm trying not to do that. It's so true. And children, when they hear materials, when we get feedback from teachers or from children on these digital learning materials, sometimes that's a complaint that the voice spoke too fast.
Yeah.
So it's something that I have to remember to do as well when I'm speaking is to slow down. I have
Yeah.
like a lot of energy, as you can tell.
No, I completely understand exactly what you're saying here. But yeah, it's a great point. It's a great point. Well, I had this other question here, and it relates to this notion of fulfillment within your work. And as we've spoken to this point, I can certainly see, how you would be able to derive elements of satisfaction and fulfillment from your work itself. And I saw something that you posted on LinkedIn not too long ago, and it was this quote. I'm just going to read it off to you really quickly here. We don't always know what the future holds, but it feels good to know I've made impact doing what I love. I'd love for you to expand on that sentiment a little bit for us here.
Yeah, that is my favorite part of the role. Like the impact is enormous and it's humbling and intense and so exciting. You just have this responsibility. So, like, for example, like the Learning Passport itself, I think is in 40 countries. We're at 6.8 million children. So, like, even the biggest university I could work at, I'll never have that type of scale. And it's not just the numbers that is impactful because like when I went to Poland, I like worked on a teacher professional development training program with subject matter experts and did the learning design on like three big courses. And the feedback of how transformative that this training was for teachers when they were experiencing so much like burnout and stress from the influx of refugees into the country and taking that on top of their normal duties and just dealing with the trauma of the children and all of that happening was amazing. I had such great feedback from that. And that is, and I went there and I saw that the refugees saw teachers interacting with them and like making them smile and laugh.
Yeah.
And it's so rewarding. So that's what I mean by impactful. A lot of the projects I worked on, like for example, Syria with the earthquake, like we worked on like a project for earthquake survivors. So it's not just always war and trauma. It could be poverty or
Mm.
situations where low literacy levels or low digital literacy levels of teachers who've never used digital technology at all and helping to like bring some digital learning into a physical classroom in a very under resourced setting is very impactful, I feel like, as well, because you're really transforming the lives of the teachers and also the students. So, yeah, that's my favorite part, I think, of working where I am.
Absolutely. I think the word that was kind of like flashing in my mind as I was listening is impact, impact, impact. Yeah, like you said, like,
Yeah.
it spread across so many different levels and layers there. Like you said, from the teachers to the children, and it's changing people's lives and trajectories in so many different ways. And that notion of scale, the fact that it's reaching so many people, and oftentimes, in some very challenging moments, as you said, whether it's a natural disaster, whether it's from some sort of conflict in the region. Yeah, you're providing a resource there that's allowing people to reclaim their lives or get things back on track. And how could that not be rewarding when you're a
Yeah.
part of a team that has this mission and not only having the mission but succeeding at it as well at different points, I'm sure. So yeah,
I've been lucky to always have done mission driven work. And like when I wrote that on LinkedIn, it's like you don't know what's gonna happen with the future of any job just because of the way the market is right now. You see so many layoffs with ed tech. Like who knows where I'll be in a year from now. But I think one of the things that I found fulfillment from is like mission driven work more than like many other factors. Like, yes, I want to be paid well,
yeah.
but like I feel like I don't want to work for something that I don't feel passionate about or I don't feel is mission driven. And that's one thing I've learned about myself. Like, that's how I feel fulfilled.
Yeah, and it's a really good point. I think a lot of people at different points, it's easy for us to kind of key in on the financial rewards of jobs and whatnot. And certainly that is an important aspect, no doubt. But at the same time, too, like it's this other side of having that meaning to your work and really considering that, whether it's something you want to get into because of reason XYZ, or when you are actually part of something and reflecting on it and finding the value in it, because ultimately, like at the end of the day, when you're hanging things up and you're finishing off your work, like that's where the fulfillment's going to come from. When you're looking back in your career, is what kind of impact you've made. And I think that that's a bit of words of wisdom too. I think for any listener is considering that element while you're doing the work. And it's so easy to kind of like push that off to the side when you're caught up in the moment of doing whatever task you're involved in. But it's so critical to remind yourself at different points. Are you aligned? Is this the right way forward for you? Does it fulfill you? Yeah.
And not all jobs are perfect. Like, there's lots of tasks that in every single job, that's another word of advice I would say is like, every job has things or tasks that are not fun or might be tedious or you
Yeah.
don't enjoy. And like, there's no perfect job out there. And your podcast is called Life as a, right? It's like the other thing that made me think of when you reached out to me was like, we're not defined by our job title. There's so much more. We're defined by like our skills and experience and what we bring to the table. So if you do change or you go to a different industry, like there's nothing wrong with that. I
Hmm.
think it must be so hard when people lose their job and they feel like they're losing their identity because it's like
Yeah.
you can continue on into whatever role that you want and like don't define yourself by what your organization is. I think that's something I've had to constantly remind myself. It's like, that's not as important as I might think it is.
Yeah, I love that insight. I think that's terrific. Well, I do have this other segment here, a water cooler story segment. And this one here, I just invite guests to indulge listeners with a story related to the work. So I'm really keen to hear what you have for us today, Don.
I've always been very like book smart, studied a lot, and I was always a good student, but street smart, I am not. Like I get lost
Okay.
very easily. Like, the kind of person that will park in a parking lot at a
Yeah.
mall and come out and like have no idea where I parked or just like go the totally wrong direction. Or when I go to the city, I only go maybe a few times a year.
Yeah.
I still will have to look at my Google Maps and be like, okay, what direction am I going when I get out of Grand Central? Like it's embarrassing.
Yeah.
So imagine me just going to random, not random, but going to countries all alone, just like just getting off of a plane, like trying to figure it out, like with that type of lack of skill. So it's more like the many times that I've gone into situations where I've been
Yeah.
completely like lost. Like,
Yeah.
for example, I remember being in Italy. So, and I'm trying to find my colleagues where they went out to eat, and I'm trying to find this restaurant, and I had no service. And so I couldn't find the restaurant. And like every other restaurant was like named something so like similar or the same. And I kept asking people and nobody could direct me. And then I'm sort of trying to talk in Spanish because I don't know Italian. And eventually that sort of helped. And I finally found it. And the same thing happened on the way home. Like, now where do I find my hotel? And which
Yeah.
direction do I go? And I'll never forget this one time. I'm like, so my long story short, I know I need to get like a SIM card. I have to purchase a SIM card. My colleague told me this. So next time when I go to Laos, in a couple of weeks, I'm going to do that so that I have data and I can get around. Because I remember in Poland, I'm sitting here trying to get back to my hotel and I ordered an Uber.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as I step out of where the Wi-Fi is in the restaurant I was in to get outside, I lost reception. And so the Uber driver is driving. I don't know where he is. I can't like pinpoint it.
Right.
I had to like go back in the restaurant, grab somebody, stand outside with me so I could connect to their phone, like hotspot, so I could get the car. So that's kind of like my water cooler story is like, I need to just learn my lesson and just be more prepared for it. I should not be getting lost in different countries around the world. So it's important to have direction sense if you take a job in the UN.
Well, I like that.
It could not turn out well. Like, luckily, I'm okay.
Well, I can definitely relate to all of this. So when you're explaining that, like, to be honest, like that's a bit of my personality in there as well. Like I've been in Japan for 20 plus years, and once Google Maps finally was, evolved to the point where that became this widespread, it made my life so much easier because I had the same sort of troubles, same sort of thing. And it's funny because like for me personally, I'm drawn to travel. I'm drawn to exploring and everything else. But I still have that challenge as well of what you just explained of easily getting lost and not being overly solid when it comes to direction. So I can relate to what you're saying there. But anyway, we do have one last segment here, a crystal ball segment. As the name implies, we're looking towards the future, trends, predictions, so on and so forth. And I'd be keen to hear a little bit more about what you're seeing within the space of digital learning or things that we should be keeping an eye on. And quite honestly, like I'm guessing we're going to be going down this track of AI. Most industries, most guests go down there, and for good reason. I mean, it's transformative. It's already making an impact right now, and we're probably on the cusp of a lot more. So I'd love to hear your insights on this.
Yeah, sure. So there's a lot of talk right now in the UN about AI and what's the ethical and safe way to use it. We've had to tread very carefully there because we have to always think about equity, access, safety, data, privacy. So all of those things are super important, but that doesn't mean that I don't use it. However, I use it a lot, but I use it mostly to create, like I said, public domain pieces of work to fill gaps. So I see it as a way to decrease equity and to decrease that digital divide by training people how to create these ebooks, audiobooks, and creating and finding ways to also improve digital accessibility and disability inclusion focused work using AI by producing materials. So anything I do is more like teacher facing or adult facing. I think where I think AI has a lot of potential and I'm really eager to get more into is using it as a tutor to help with catch up learning and to close the learning loss gaps because remember when COVID happened around the world, well, even in the US, we had a huge learning loss. So if you can imagine in underdeveloped countries, that learning loss was even greater. So I would love to be able to use that to help close those gaps and to put those tools in the hands of kids and teachers to help improve teaching and learning. However, we just have to be really careful what tools we're using. I'm not allowed to promote any sort of tool as however, like certain ones, Magic School, I thought was like pretty decent in terms of just being able to go in there and help very basically, create lesson plans or to create an AI safe assignment or to a UDL choice board. Because again, when we're talking about disability and inclusion, like how do we create content for somebody who has a learning disability, who has a hearing loss, who has vision impaired? So I'm really passionate about using AI and tools to decrease those gaps in equity, but proceeding with caution to make sure that we're thinking and designing with them and making sure that we're testing with people who have these disabilities at the same time.
It's a really interesting time, like I said, across industries. And when it comes to AI, I find that a lot of people, and what I keep continually hearing is just trying to find the boundaries, the boundaries for AI. Like you said, what are some of the
Yeah,
safe ways of going
guardrails.
about it? How can we use it? How can we use it as a tool, first of all, not let it like completely take over? Being aware of that fact, I think is a key point. But again, like I said, that boundaries, that notion of boundaries of how far can we take it, that we can derive some of the benefits it offers, but not letting it run wild and get ourselves in trouble. And that's kind of what I was picking up, listening to you. I don't know if that's
Yeah.
accurate or not, but
Yeah, I think ethics plays a really big role in the way that I use that just even in my life. I mean, I use AI just like every day in almost like so many different ways that I
yeah,
feel like I can't even imagine going back to without it. It's like
right.
a trusty companion for everything. Yeah, I know it's interesting. I guess we'll see what happens with the future. And also access, I think cost is
Mm,
another thing that we think about too. It's like, is there going to be even more of an equity gap if it's so expensive that not everyone gets a chance to have it? And I am also always looking into programs to improve the digital literacy of students and teachers. And so if they don't have access to those tools for a digital workforce of the future, I'm also concerned that they're going to get left behind, and then their future, their ability to move, socioeconomic class and to change their lives with education, and it's going to be hindered if they don't have access to these tools to learn. So I also fight with that. I really wish I could just speed that up because I'm afraid people are going to get left behind.
well, some great insights there. And I can't believe we've blown through this conversation. Feels like we just got started here, Don, but I've thoroughly enjoyed all of this. And I know listeners are going to really enjoy many of the insights that you shared. So thanks for taking some time and joining the program today.
Yeah, thanks for having me. I appreciate it.
Now, for those interested in learning more about Dawn and her work, you can do so via the UNICEF website for Learning Passport. You can also find her at East End Advertising, her graphic design agency, as well as on LinkedIn. And for reference, all this information, including links, will be in the show notes. And hey, if you like today's show, please be sure to tell a friend and share to show further support. You can always rate, review, and subscribe wherever you access your podcasts. And as I mentioned off the top, I do have that YouTube channel, so you can head on over there and take in the content in a different manner. And if you do, as I always say, I would love that like or subscribe. It's the best way to let that algorithm know that this content matters, that should be put in front of more people. And finally, don't forget to join us on the next episode of Life as a, where we'll continue to explore and unearth the details of professions and the people behind them. I'm your host, Christopher Schoenwald. Until next time, stay curious about life and living.